Tonight we have a speaker. Our speaker is Matt Walton. He's sat over there, stood over there. I actually got told off because I missed out on this slide, the never-ending bit, and just put the road to product market fit, which is obviously a lot more of a simple talk. Matt is a product leader, coach and advisor. He works with edtech startups and scale-ups, and actually runs a fellowship program, a cohort program, all about product market fit for edtech businesses. So yeah, I'd like to introduce Matt, everyone.
Have the power. Thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be in Brighton because I actually lived in Brighton. I live in London now, but I lived in Brighton for about 4 years a while back, and so it's been really brilliant to be vaguely nostalgic and so on. So I'm really, really delighted to come and talk to you all tonight. So this is not the right slide deck. I need the right slide deck. Sick beginning. And I'm not going to do any of that. I'm also disappointed about how kind of like professional my slide looked compared to all of the shiny glasses and cats. Anyway, so this does now not work. Does that work now? Yes, right. Who am I? So I am Matt. I started my career, I guess, in the year 2000. I managed to blag my way into the BBC, and then at some point they made me a producer because that's how the BBC understood the world. They called everyone producers. But at some point, this idea of product management came along. Software companies and people like The Guardian started to use the term, and so did the BBC. And I was like, yes, that's what it is that I do, because I've been working with groups of engineers and designers and content people to build new digital things. So I was spent about 10 years there, and then I became FutureLearn, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I left FutureLearn in 2020, and as I work with edtech startups and scale-ups, and I do coaching and advising, and I also run a fellowship program all about finding product market fit, which is obviously what we're going to be talking about tonight. Wrong way. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the FutureLearn journey because it will kind of start to, I guess, sow the seeds and set the seeds. I'm going to talk briefly through the kind of highs and lows. So FutureLearn was founded back at the end of 2012 when the whole massive open online course movement was going off in the US, which is where universities were starting to make some of their courses available for free. And the Open University, who has been doing distance learning since the late 60s, basically saw that there was this disruption happening and that they wanted to do something that would kind of counter it. And their vice chancellor at the time was not your classic university vice chancellor. He was an inspiring man called Martin Bean, whose background was Microsoft. So he was like, I'm going to start a startup to kind of do something about this. And because he charismatic guy, he managed to get 12 universities to kind of back the project within a week, which in the higher education sector is sort of somewhat unheard of. So I got involved in the early days of 2013, and my brief to start help kind of work out what the vision for the product might be and to put together a plan for how you might go about delivering it. And before I knew it, like the whole thing had kind of like gained momentum. I'd promised to launch a thing in September, and actually we ended up doing that. So we launched 26 courses from 26 universities by that point in September 2013. And such was the kind of interest and demand in massive open online courses at the time. We had to cap the first courses at 10,000 learners each because there was a real appetite, and we actually didn't know whether the platform would support them. So that was the kind of beginning of the adventure. And then this kind of idea of this never-ending road then begins. So we introduced our first business model early the next year. then as soon as we'd done that, the focus then became about how do we grow? And so it was a relentless focus on how we kind of get people to know about us. And I think 2015, early in that, we kind of got to 1 million learners. And then shortly after that, we ran what I think is still the biggest ever MOOC in the world, which was 100,000 people on a course from the British Council. We then started this kind of like, as you'll see, becomes a theme, like testing different business models. At that point, the OU invested a bit more money in us. And then, oh, still going the wrong way. There we go. And then, so we then like hit on this idea of like stringing a number of courses together and some assessment, and started to persuade people to offer academic credit towards things. And then Deakin University were like, can we run degrees on your platform? Now, this was like something that we thought we might do at some point, but actually like the fact that they came to us quite quickly was a bit of a surprise. We then continued to look at different business models, so introduced this idea of an upgrade, which was something that you could pay for at the beginning of the course. And the course, by this point, we kind of got to 7 million 100 courses. Coventry put 50 degrees on the platform. We then we introduced a subscription model because we're still trying to work out how do we make this thing work, as I'll come back to in a moment. And then Seek, who's an Australian company, invested 50 million in the company. And then we had the pandemic, which was a massive boom in edtech and so on. And so by the middle of that year, we'd got 15 million learners and 160 university partners from all over the world and 1,200 courses and so on. So it'd been a massive roller coaster ride. Now, at that point, my boss, Simon Nelson, decided that now was the time for him to move on. And I was like, actually, this bit here, surprisingly stressful. Massive new investor breathing down your neck, massive expectations, suddenly pandemic, everything's blowing up, going big, and you're moving an entire team online and all that kind of stuff. So at that point, I was like, right, I've been here 7 years. Now, that's kind of, in some ways, the end of the story, but I think it is worth noting that then, you know, another 2.5 years kind of went by, and I think the fact that we still probably at the point I hadn't left, hadn't entirely cracked the commercial model, then like kind of came home to roost probably about 2.5 years later, which is where there was then the bubble burst on the kind of what was going on after the pandemic with EdTech, and there was layoffs, and then the OU and Seek actually sold FutureLearn to another business. So I guess I wanted just to kind of tell that story to show that like it's a roller coaster ride, and I will come back to that in a moment. But basically, this has kind of like led me to be really curious about this kind of idea of product market fit. And how do you know if you've got it? And what do you do to find it? And or if you've got it, you lose it, then how do you find it again? So one of the things that I did as I started freelancing was I worked with an EdTech investor called Emerge, and we put on events a bit like this, but online. And we got EdTech leaders to kind of talk about the things that they had seen work. So people from successful organizations, as you see on the screen. So I'm going to share like some of the kind of learnings from that this evening. But before I do that, I thought it was worth to kind of like step back and kind of think about, well, what is this idea of product market fit? So I think it was originally coined by this man, and every time I look at this picture, I'm always still astounded by how Mekon-like his head is, which is probably something I shouldn't say, especially if it's being recorded. So this is Mark Andreessen. So he was like an early internet pioneer. He was the founder of Netscape, if you kind of remember like the early days of the internet browsers and so on. And he's now one of the biggest investors in Silicon Valley. And he wrote this essay, which he called The Only Thing That Matters. And he was basically reflecting as like kind of product people and founders often like really focus on the product, but they don't think enough about the market. And so he coined the term and described it as being in a good market with a product that can satisfy that market. And now he went on to say, in a great market, a market with lots of potential customers, the market pulls the product out of the startup. Conversely, in a terrible market, you can have the best product in the world and an absolutely killer team, and you're still going to fail. So this idea was then built on by lots of other people, like notably the Lean startup with Eric Ries, and then Dan Olson, who wrote the Lean Product Playbook. And he updated the definition to be meeting the underserved needs of target customers better than the competition or the alternative. And he kind of suggested some various steps that you might work through in order to get there. And this is illustrated in this diagram here. And then more recently, Lenny, who writes Lenny's newsletter, went to his extensive black book and asked people what they thought product market fit was, and basically then consolidated down all of the responses into these 3 bubbles, which is that you've made a product that people want, you can make a profit delivering this product to people at scale, and you can find and keep people sustainably. Now, I quite like this definition because you can start to see like how you might go about like validating what you're doing against it and what you do about it. He also noted that product market fit is a spectrum as opposed to something that you do or don't have. Which brings me on to the kind of final point on this, which is where I've stolen the name of the talk from. So Brian Balfour, who he led growth at HubSpot, I think, for a long time, and he now runs Reforge. He has written quite a lot about product market fit, and he said that it's a process that never ends, primarily for one reason: your market doesn't sit still, it's always moving. And as your market moves, your product needs to move along with it, making product market fit a pulse that you need to constantly keep your thumb on. And so that definitely is the kind of stuff that we were feeling in the journey that I outlined earlier. So, do you have product market fit? So one of the things I've been trying to do is like kind of find ways where people can easily like start to like get a mental model for like, well, what's going on with things, and start to maybe like find ways of diagnosing where they might be at. And so it's all, I'm been using another quite well-known product framework, which is this idea of desirable, viable, feasible, and usable. So I think originally the desirable, viable, and feasible came from IDEO, who pioneered design thinking. And so when they were looking at how do you create innovative businesses, you need to make sure you've done those 3 things. And then Marty Kagan, I think, split out the desirable bit and added like usable to the list, which I think is kind of worth considering in terms of have you got product market fit. So I then have kind of written a definition for each of these things, which if you think back to the Lenny bubbles, it's kind of very similar. And so I've said it needs to be you need to deliver an experience, and I've done this in the EdTech kind of world, but you can change the word learners for doctors or people or whatever might be appropriate in your space. So you're delivering an experience that learners want and need. It needs to be viable, so you can reach and retain learners sustainably and make a profit. It needs to be usable, so learners can achieve the learning outcomes in a way that's practical for them, which is often forgotten. And it needs to be feasible, so you can deliver the learning outcomes in a repeatable and scalable way. And that's often really hard in education because the magic often comes through the experience with humans. And the reason I put them on this kind of 2 by 2 is the top 2 are actually kind of about the market. So the desirability bit and the viability bit is all about really understanding the market space that you're in. And the bottom 2 are very much about the product. So is it usable and is it feasible to deliver it? And then if you look at the left-hand side, like that's very much about the customers, or in my world, the learners, and the demand side. So like, do your users desire it and can they use it? And the right-hand side becomes very much about the supply side, or the business, or educators in my world. Like, so is it viable and is it feasible as a business? And so this starts to give a kind of framework to I guess, kind of like reflect on where you're at, and if you're sort of struggling in different areas, like, and this like, have you got this kind of amorphous thing that is product market fit? This then allows you to start to kind of dig into like what might be going on. So if I go back to that Future Learn journey, just to sort of bring this to life, so I popped some virtual post-it notes on this grid. And so like in the desirable bit, so we, as you saw, we got like rapid early growth in learners and university partners. And then we even got like universities approaching to us saying, we love your platform, can we run degrees? So like there was definitely something going on about the desirability there. But it was really hard to convert learners into paying learners. And so we ended up doing various pieces of research to see like why people were using FutureLearn, and identified this group we called advancers who were using it to advance their career. They were the people that were actually paying for courses. But then it became quite hard to get universities to run the kinds of courses that we thought that people wanted. So we looked at things like commissioning, and we got new partners involved and so on. So that was some of the wrestling that was going on there. And then meanwhile, over in the viable bit, we had to experiment a lot with SEO and viral models, because paid marketing was too expensive in terms of the lifetime value that you got from the learners. And as you saw, there was this constant experimentation between different business models, so certificates, upgrades, this idea of programs, and then a subscription model. In order to make it feasible and scalable, we realized we had to work with lots and lots and lots of partners in order to build the catalog. And we actually also struggled in the early days to get partners to rerun successful courses, because the academics were involved, and often this was sort of done alongside their kind of core work. So that then led us to also tackle what was a kind of usability issue, in that learners didn't want to wait for a course to start. They wanted to do it straight away. So we actually then ended up moving to an on-demand model, which both helped universities make sure they reran the courses, because they were actually always available. So that kind of just gives you an idea of like how you can start to sort of use this model to think through some of these things. So I thought, before I go on and like share some of the kind of lessons learned from the case studies, maybe we could do a few minutes where you have a brief chat to your neighbor and reflect on those different boxes and think about, like, where are you feeling confident, and are there areas where you're kind of feeling worried? So we'll do this for a few minutes, and then maybe, like, if anyone's feeling brave, maybe we'll get some people to say something. Yeah? And if you're online, then I think do it in the chat online. I'm really enjoying the hubbub that has just been created. I love a good hubbub. So does somebody want to kind of like maybe share some reflections from the conversation that's been had? Does someone want to maybe start with the easy one, like where might you be feeling confident in terms of? You caught my eye there. Not him. I think we're meant to be passing the mic, so it's for posterity.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. So I'm the product and tech founder for a business that we started in Brighton about 6 years ago. Essentially, we sell software to big brands who want to test creative before they launch. So it's across things like e-commerce, advertising, packaging in store, quite a wide variety. And I guess maybe where we're confident, or I'm confident, is definitely the kind of desirability of it. Like, I think the market's gone through a change where maybe 6 years ago, there was a lot of resistance around using data and tech to assess creative performance and effectiveness. It was kind of not really a data-led domain, it felt like at the time. But I think kind of over the last 6 years, we've seen a big shift in that becoming kind of front and center for brands who are producing content at scale globally, who need a way of kind of monitoring and assessing creative quality globally in a consistent way. What I was just kind of sharing as maybe a challenge for us is it's quite hard to know what good looks like in terms of usage, to track usage and understand if we're actually doing well or not, because sometimes it feels like the usage stats are constrained to the life cycle of content and how often people actually produce stuff versus like how much can we affect that.
Yeah.
And what, how do we think about having the right value metrics to track, whether we're succeeding from that perspective. So I guess, that's tricky. And maybe the other thing we're worried about is we really built a tool for brands to do this, on a campaign basis, and it's been quite an ad hoc thing. And we're trying to find ways of being more embedded and more sticky as a product, so that we've got kind of that defensibility and that moat aspect of things. So, yeah,
that's a great reflection. And so it sounds like the market has kind of come to you, but what you were just kind of reflecting on in terms of what does good look like is, I think, often really hard, because there's so many things that are out there written about, like, daily active learners and like, retention is the kind of big driver. But like definitely in the world of education, that's often hard because people turn to learning at a particular time and moment of need. And so like that's another example, I guess, similar to yours, of like, we need to do this thing now, and then we may not need to do it for a bit. So being able to kind of step back and work out what's a kind of realistic measure of success, I think, is often helpful and hard. So yeah. Anyone else like to share something that came out of their conversation?
Hi, I'm John. I basically a month ago just started my own company, doing sort of data analytics for small businesses. So my sort of worry at the moment is because I'm taking those first steps out there is whether or not my business is viable. And it's slightly different in terms of some of the perhaps the other businesses because I am the product.
Yeah.
I'm not designing anything. I'm using sort of existing tools for, to help businesses understand their data. So, and it's like you said, is there a market for small businesses? Do they really understand the data and how I can position myself to be as usable to them as possible in the nicest possible way? And that's sort of a bit of a concern because despite having years of experience doing it on your own for the first time as a kind of a startup, as a founder, you have that kind of imposter syndrome as well. So knowing that what I'm doing is viable is kind of a bit of a sort of concern and at the moment. So, but this is a really good sort of matrix to kind of use because you have these thoughts and having something like this where you can actually put them down. And then once you put them down in the right place, then hopefully you can work on it. So.
Cool. That's a great reflection because, this definitely does work at multiple levels, like from the individual upwards, which as a product person, obviously, when you get these frameworks, you then start to apply it to everything. But like the channels bit, I think is really interesting in the viable bit. It's like, how do you actually find people is often the challenge. And obviously, if you're just one person, like how do you make that scalable and repeatable? Like, interesting. Anyone else kind of got something they'd like to share? Oh, Dom's itching there. Or is you're just getting the mic back? I'll put you on the spot now. Here we go. It's all right. You've been saved.
I'll share something instead. Hi, I'm Libty. I'm a product engineer for a startup. Although it's quite interesting because it's a startup owned by a bigger company who has probably, I'd say we've had product market fit. So we're a company who's doing, I guess, it's all about making investing accessible through both education, but also like insights and analysis. And so I think we found product market fit, but then when the market went down, I guess we then struggled. And so it's interesting kind of trying to find it again in some ways. And so, definitely know that it's desirable. There are plenty of people who like want to learn to invest in an accessible way. It's interesting because I think usability, we're decent at, I'd like to say as an engineer, but in some ways, but not a consistent UX, I would say. And so, for example, we have some features that are on app that aren't on web, and we're trying to push web more now. So I've got to, I guess, figure that out. Viability, I think this is the hard thing for us now. And I guess having been a startup, but now having to have a kind of revenue model of a larger company is quite interesting and hard. Not something I luckily have to worry that much about. But I think with the whole paid marketing as well being expensive, we're trying to go down the SEO route a bit more. So that's quite interesting.
Oh, interesting. We might come back to that in terms of molding your products to your channels. So spoiler alert. Anything else that we haven't heard from this group? I saw some gesticulation going on earlier, so I'm intrigued.
So I guess our issue is really around, it kind of crosses between viability and feasibility. So we provide supply chain solutions. So we have software that controls warehouses and distribution. And for years, we've been driven by kind of inbound requests from large customers. So the whole of our product development was really based on what do our biggest customers want. And one of the good things about our software is we can bespoke it quite easily into those markets. But now all those chickens are coming home to roost because we've got lots of configuration options. It's a bit of a mess as a product. So we're starting to roadmap it, and so we're using tools like focus groups to try and change the direction really and get a more roadmap driven direction to it.
So it's basically, this is where your big worry is.
We're trying to work out how we can make it feasible for the long term, because at the moment it's not really feasible. All of the work that we do is not as profitable as it should be.
Yeah, that feels like a kind of classic thing for the sort of stage that you're at. Cool. Thank you, everyone. That's been a really nice, and thank you for sharing, because like some of this stuff is like, you know, hard and complicated stuff. So, but I think that's kind of like brought to life some of like the challenges here. And I think you touched on some of the sort of not uncommon things that people find when they're reflecting on this stuff. So hopefully like there might be some things in here that you can take away and do something with. We'll see. So what I'm about to share is essentially like looking back over like the 11 case studies that I did. I was looking for, well, where are the macro trends that where there's things that just keep coming up again and again, and therefore like there should be like some, you know, hopefully like bigger learning to come out of this. So the first insight that I've drawn out of this is like successful ventures pay attention to trends. So the first, and there's different kinds of trends, and I'm going to start with like the sexiest first, which is regulatory trends. But multiverse is like, possibly with the exception of Kahoot, I think the biggest edtech startup that's come out of the UK. And they basically built their business on this new trend of like this idea of the apprenticeship levy, which basically made organizations have to like pay for apprenticeships, otherwise they lost the money in tax. And they spotted that the market didn't very well cater for tech skills, which was obviously been growing a lot over the few years since multiverse had been around. But that was the basis that they then founded the business, but they then have like kind of continued to plow that furrow. So when I talked to Gordon McRae, who had headed up the learning product side there, he talked about how they started to see this real kind of growing like need in clients for data literacy, and that they recognized that there was a kind of data technician standard. And they ended up actually building 2 different programs off the back of that. And by the second quarter of running that program, it had become their kind of second biggest program. So they continued to kind of do this thing around regulation. Another common set of trends was technology. So Sana Labs, that's on the screen at the moment, actually have been around for, I think, nearly a decade. And very early on this kind of idea of like AI technology becoming much more accessible. And they hired engineers from places like Spotify that have been doing recommendation engines and were like, how do we apply this to adaptive learning? And so they've recently, I think, raised quite a big Series B, and they've even recently introduced a new product, which is an AI assistant. Social is another kind of trend. So this one is the Raspberry Pi Foundation, and they ran code clubs where they would get technologists to go into schools and teach kids how to code using Scratch. And then obviously the pandemic happened and they couldn't go into schools. So they were left kind of scrambling as to how do we carry on this thing in a world where we can't go into schools. Now, Laura, who was the head of product there, did some foundational research and dug into some of the kind of deeper trends that were going on, and found that like things like Roblox and Minecraft and so on were being used increasingly as a replacement for the kind of social interaction. And so that was really important to what the kids were doing. And she also found that the parents were actually surprisingly comfortable with it if you did it in the right way. So that was the big insight that they then bet that on for their new Code Club World online product. Another example of a social trend is, this is Lucy from a company called Bridge U, and she describes herself as a third world child. And she basically grew up in lots of different countries, going to international schools, and spotted that there was growing interest in like going to UK and American universities from Africa and from Asia. But actually the guidance was pretty rubbish in terms of how schools could actually support people to do that. So she was like, well, there's an unmet need here, and created a product which was all about university guidance. You can also combine trends. So this is Ahmed from a company called Trilogy, and they spotted about the same time that we were starting FutureLearn that there was this big growing trend in boot camps. And so things like General Assembly were getting going. And at the same time, universities were also increasingly working with companies like 2U to help them put university degrees online. And there was this growing acceptance of like using private companies to do that. So they combined those 2 trends, and then they launched a university badged bootcamp, and actually ended up selling to 2U. They were successful at it. I think it's also worth noting that in this bucket, this idea of channel trends popped up. So Study Smarter, who do kind of revision type stuff, realized that TikTok was going to be a big thing for their audience, and they got in pretty early on and got quite a lot of exclusive access and in a sort of fairly uncrowded market. And I heard a similar thing from Blinkist, who got in early doors on the Facebook lookalike audiences. So channel trends are also something that's worth paying attention to. So the second insight is about investing in continuous discovery. And one of the great kind of examples of this is Springboard, who are an online boot camp, although they didn't start out that way. So they started out back in the early days when we were starting to put courses online at FutureLearn. They provided a search engine for this sort of growing market of online courses. And then they started to string them together. And then in 2014, they then added like mentoring around it, and then like started to kind of sell it as a kind of guided course. Now, they then realized that the people doing it were people that were switching career, and that career support was a really kind of important part of what they could offer. So then in 2016, they launched their career track product, and that not only gave career support, but it also gave a job guarantee, and they were one of the first to do that. And Parol, who was the founder there, said that it really changed the trajectory of the company. It improved the margin significantly and got us to much tighter product market fit, and accelerated our growth in the market, which at the time wasn't very crowded. Now, they kept doing it. So actually in 2018, I think it was, they did some more research. And so at this point, their biggest course was a UX course. But they did some research that suggested that a combined UI and UX course would be even more popular. But the team were a bit like, but this is our biggest course. You're going to cannibalize our biggest course. But Parol decided to do it, and now it basically accounts for half their revenue. And I think actually, as kind of product people, you can kind of reflect on the sort of trend of full stack designers. That kind of makes sense. So yes, they kept disrupting themselves. And this is a similar story at BridgeU. So BridgeU basically created a market leading position for this new university guidance stuff with schools, sold to a lot of schools, and then realized that they had a load of insights that would be very valuable to universities. They knew kind of who wanted to go to which universities and so on. So they took the bold move to then start to sell to universities. And then in order to then, I guess, make that much more valuable to universities, they made the product free for schools. So they were able to basically like distribute that guidance advice to far more people, but they also ended up ultimately increasing their margins and profits because they then sold to a totally different audience. So it's another really nice example of like, you know, lateral thinking, being bold, and not being scared to disrupt yourself. So Joel from Sana Labs describes this as prioritizing exploration over exploitation. And he talked about in the early days, he was really worried because his team had basically shipped this product, and all they wanted to do, having made this product, is just make that product better and better and better. And he was like, oh, we are actually iterating something that doesn't have product market fit. So he basically, yeah, like was like, we need to like keep exploring new things in a similar way to people that we've just heard. Another thing that came up a lot in the whole discovery bucket was getting close to your users. So Laura, when they were doing that foundational research, they started to build a community of people that had gone to those code clubs and used them to like test like literally every week to try and work out what it was they were doing. This is Kahoot, and I love this kind of picture and the story that goes with it. So Jamie, who was the co-founder at Kahoot, talked about when they went into schools in the early days to try and like learn how the product was going. He talked about there being this kid at the back that was loving the game so much he was standing on his desk. So I asked the teacher, is that okay? And she said, yes, he's the most disruptive kid in his year, and I've never seen him this engaged in learning. And so at that point they were like, wow, how do we scale this? And then to go back to Multiverse, they explored lots of opportunities, and Gordon made this great point that they weren't scared to like, before they even actually really had a product, to go and pitch it to their customers and see what they got back. And he talked about how lots of people don't do that because they're worried about the credibility that they might blow. But actually, they found that customers really enjoyed being involved that early in the process, and like involving them then made sure that they found a product that they definitely wanted. So that was the second insight. The third insight is focusing on your North Star. So Joel from Sana Labs brought this to life through the means of a parable. So he talked about 3 bricklayers that, maybe apocryphally, Christopher Wren saw building the new St. Paul's Cathedral, and he asked them what they were doing. And the first bricklayer says, I'm a bricklayer, I am building a wall. The second bricklayer says, I'm a builder and I am earning money to feed my family. And the third bricklayer says, I am a cathedral builder and I am building a cathedral. And so Joel was like, how can we like make everyone who works for the organization think they're building a cathedral? And how do they know like what are the kind of bricks that like take you there? So like this is St. Paul's Cathedral, but this is the kind of 6 weekly cadence that he kind of talked about in terms of how they make sure that everyone kind of knows what they're doing, ladders up to picture. Like they basically test the things they're going to build as a kind of vision prototype thing. They make trailers rather than MVPs and put that in front of people and get responses back. So this idea of like kind of how do you like break things down and start to define the magic was a thing that came up. So this is Ahmed from Trilogy, who basically they had a scalability problem, and like some of their things were going really well, and they were like, well, why do people like these things? And they broke them down into these different buckets, and then they worked out, well, how would you measure these things? And then they did things like relentless surveying to try and understand like if they were improving things along the way, which was again a similar thing that came out of talking to Kirsten from Buzu, who do a language learning app, and she talked about this idea of a North Star metric, which is the kind of thing that kind of encapsulates the value that you're delivering to users. And if you can pick a good one of those, then it can have a rich effect on your roadmap and get people thinking about, well, how do we experiment and what should we iterate? But you then need to start to break it down. And so she shared this thing, which is you've got your North Star metric, and then you can work out, well, what are the behaviors that sit underneath that might drive that North Star metric? And then if you understand that, then what are the kind of tactics that you can do where each of the teams they might be able to do something about it. Insight is make growth everyone's job. So Jamie from Kahoot talked about basically getting everyone to do a stint doing user support and being able to empathize with users. Holger from Blinkist talked about like how hard it was to get people in the product team to kind of work on the marketing stuff, and as soon as he managed to create a cross-functional team around that, it was transformational in terms of their traction. And then this idea of like what I think is known as channel product fit came up quite often, which is this idea of like how do you mold your product to channels, because you can't change how a channel works, but you can change how your product works. So picking the one that's most appropriate and then like working with that channel can often pay dividends. So with Blinkist, they originally thought it was a viral model. They thought, oh, people are going to want to share the fact that they're listening to what they call blinks, which are kind of summaries of kind of factual books. But it didn't work for them. But they found that actually, when they experimented with Facebook's early lookalike audience stuff, that people were like trying to kill time on their phone, and actually that was the time where actually you could spend 20 minutes learning about reading a book, and so that was really successful for them. Meanwhile, Study Smarter, because they do exam prep, they found that actually people search for things, and like Maurice from there said that he wished they'd started on SEO earlier, because every time there was an article, you ended up with this kind of compounding growth of like you invested in it once, but then it would keep kind of paying off. And I think they've got like 700 people now writing content. And then for Kahoot, it was viral. So with Kahoot, the product gets better the more people that use it. So like you need quiz players to play a quiz, and then you need people to create the quizzes. And like their model was very much about a viral one. And Jamie said that he knew they were on the right track when they started to see these memes of like Kahoot and chill and all this kind of stuff. But they also saw it from teachers. And then the final insight basically like just brings together the things that I've just shared really, which is that you need to develop a growth mindset and think about like doing something ambitious and constantly kind of iterating towards it. So Joel has this lovely expression which he acknowledged didn't really make sense, which is doing something difficult is easier than doing something easy. And he reckoned that that was because it allowed them to raise funds. They could recruit some great people, and then it was much easier to inspire them to do stuff than like doing something that no one was particularly inspired to do. Ooh. And then the final words we'll leave to Parol from Springboard. And she said, there's no point where you can say, okay, I'm done. It's very important to cultivate a growth mindset, even when you're a 9-year-old company, and you need to continue to think about what's relevant for today's customers and build for that. So hopefully I've convinced you of that. So the 5 trends were pay attention to trends. Sorry, the 5 themes were pay attention to trends, invest in continuous discovery, focus on your North Star, make job and develop a growth mindset. And you need to do that because, wrong way again. You need to do that because it's a never-ending road. Thank you very much. And if you're interested, there's loads more that I've been publishing on Substack. So if you want to go and read some of those case studies in detail, you can go and find it there.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. Really good talk. I'm just going to switch back to our deck real quick, and then we'll do our Q&A. Oh, gladiators, hang on. Awesome. Thanks so much. Has anyone got any questions for Matt? No? I'm happy to kick one off. So you mentioned one of your quotes was from someone that was like, you know, all you want to do is iterate on something that's out there, but actually you can't do that until you have that product market fit. So I'm just interested in how maybe you can sway difficult stakeholders, or maybe people that are kind of like interested in just keeping something kind of iterating rather than like finding that fit, or who aren't quite believers that that fit isn't there. Have you got any tips for people on that?
I think it probably is about the kind of second insight, which is investing in discovery. So I think you can't ask people to take a bet on like a hope, but I think you can keep, and one of the things that I talk about in the course is this idea of like dual track agile, where like if you can spend some time on the whole kind of constant like little discovery loops whilst you're doing the big delivery loops, then stuff will emerge in the discovery that then is worth like spending time on. But I think if you can keep, and it's to do also with the trends, if you can keep an eye on the market, you can then talk to people, you can spot things, and then maybe like try things out in the smallest way possible, then I think that then starts to build the compelling case, which is, well, we could spend the time doing this and like get maybe 10% more, or we could spend the time doing that and like get 10 times more, or but it's hard, and I think actually getting people to let you invest in the discovery can often be hard as well, which is where I would always recommend, like, don't say stop delivery, like, and we're going to go spend some time discovering stuff. It's like, how do you kind of fit that in as a sort of dual track alongside keeping everyone happy by delivering the stuff that they think you should be delivering.
So keeping the discovery track going in the background while you still deliver stuff. Okay, awesome, great.
And I think also, like, there's 2 kinds of research. Like, there's the directional stuff, which might be like usability testing or concept testing, but then there's also the foundational bit, which is more like where you're doing the kind of jobs to be done type interviewing and having a sort of broader scope. And I think it's the broader scope which is often where these like more disruptive ideas come from. And I think often people think about research very much as like testing the thing rather than like the bigger picture of like, well, what are people doing with the thing and what else might they want to do?
Awesome. Did you have one, Tom?
I've got a question there. Do you think there is a kind of road to recovery if you end up in a position where perhaps maybe your product is failing quite badly and you've not done quite enough discovery, but you decide it's important?
I'll try not to take that as too loaded a question. I think it really depends, and I think it can be hard, like particularly like when you've got a big team, like then that often becomes harder. And I think the way to do that then is maybe have a smaller team, like being able to, like, it's like the classic idea of the innovator's dilemma. Like, so the kind of big example is like Kodak invented the digital camera, but then they sat on it because they were selling so much film, and then it was too late. But if you can try and be working on that new stuff alongside the old world, but then I think that's where, like, it becomes a kind of more urgent thing to do, and the sort of burning platform. So it can be hard, and I think that's why trying to avoid that situation by doing the continuous discovery is so important. But it's often something that doesn't happen, I think, because people think that this idea of product market fit is you get it and then you're done, and like then you're just like constantly like making hay. But like, yeah, at some point someone's going to have your lunch.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Got a question which will hopefully reinforce what I'm doing, but how important is data in what you're doing with the product cycle in terms of collecting it and the root cause analysis? And you might get a result but that says what, but how do you dig down and to understand the why?
So I always think trying to combine the sort of quantitative stuff and the qualitative stuff is where the magic happens, because the data often does give you a kind of like what's going on, but then you kind of need to go and talk to people to understand the why. And then sometimes you might see a why, and then you can kind of try and unpick that behavior in the data to kind of back up, well, are they actually doing what they say they're doing? So yeah, I think the two hand in hand, like in the early stages, often there isn't enough data to, like, you know, be statistically relevant. So that often is where you end up relying more on the qualitative stuff. And then I think as you get bigger, like, you know, there's loads of companies that have been, you know, Facebook is massively successful at just trying loads of different A/B tests and like almost not bothering with the foundational research. So I think that you can then, if you then develop that kind of culture of like testing everything, then you can, but you need a lot of people and a lot of throughput. So again, it sort of depends on the product. It works for sort of big consumer products, but maybe not the more B2B stuff. Does that?
Thanks. So my question was more about maybe from a team building point of view, sort of, I guess, any experience or thoughts or reflections from what you've done in the past about how to try and build effective teams to then achieve these things, like the dynamic, the different skills together, how they combine best, how to think about cross-functional teams, how you get the balance of collaboration and going after different goals.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of cross-functional teams. I've recently been reflecting on, depending on the kind of work. So if you're doing what I would call pioneering work, which is more that like 10x, like we don't really know what it is, then actually having quite a small group of people that's very multi-skilled, like, is probably best, like, because you want them to move quickly, you want them to have a tight kind of communication kind of thing. And then once you understand it a bit more and it becomes more about scaling it, or how do we actually repeat this thing, then you can actually have a bigger team, because it's kind of a better understood thing. We did at one point have, we tried to make everything cross-functional at FutureLearn, and actually that didn't work, because there are certain jobs where it's, I guess, a much more known problem that actually you can just give to a specialist to go and do. Like, you know, our partnership managers, they just spent their time with universities, like kind of getting them to do what they needed to do, and putting them in a cross-functional team wasn't helpful. They still had a relationship with the cross-functional team to help inform the solutions, I guess, that the product teams are building. So yeah, so I think I would say that. What was the other part of the question?
It's quite open, but I guess I was kind of, for me, I was thinking about that balance between the external facing and internal facing kind of aspects of teams, and how you get a good balance of.
Oh, the other thing that you made me think about was like how you set them goals. And I think often people think about making teams autonomous, and that means like almost letting them pick their own missions and so on. But I think actually, like, particularly if you've got multiple teams, from a leadership point of view, you need to have a very clear strategy, which is that kind of cathedral and North Star metric point. Then what are the problems that teams need to go and solve? And then let them solve it in whatever way they want to, but like be really clear about what the problem is and like lead with context. And I think often where people go wrong with like OKRs is OKRs don't explicitly say like, don't have the why in there. They kind of have the what and then the how you measure it, but they don't have the why. So, so I think in terms of making, like what I've learned, I guess, in sometimes the hard way in terms of making teams autonomous is that you actually have to do more work on how you set the objectives and how you share the context with teams to then like not micromanage later on, because otherwise Chinese whispers happens and then you're like, why are they doing that? And like, that's very hard.
Thanks. Yeah, great.
Thanks, yeah.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts or advice on, I guess, finding market fit when you have for like multiple products at the same time, and yeah, kind of how you deal with that. It might be a hard one. Yeah, I guess so. For example, we have as I kind of mentioned, a B2C product which has had product market fit, which kind of I guess we need to improve on a bit. But then we have like a B2B side as well, and we have spotted an opportunity that that we want to try and pursue to find product market fit. But what I find interesting is like, how are we gonna do both at the same time, and how much should one kind of, how much time do you allocate to something that could become a big opportunity if you manage it, but also could totally not?
I mean, I think that's a similar answer to the, like, because that's a kind of future possible thing. So I think it's probably put a small team on exploring that and like be almost explicit about how much time we're going to spend on that versus that, and try and like don't get stuck in like building a minimum viable product. Like how do you like test it and like, do like something that will test the opportunity as quickly as possible to work out whether it's worth spending more time. I quite like Teresa Torres's opportunity solution tree thing and it's helpful because I think it helps like have the conversation as a team about like, for those of you who don't know, it has like the outcome at the top, various opportunities, and then sub opportunities, and then solutions. And you don't fill out the whole tree. You like go down a certain branch, and then like I think it's about communicating, well, why are we going down this branch? And then like testing lots of potential solutions about it is like quite a useful mental model. So like being able to say, we're doing this branch and we're like, this is our current opportunity and we're planning this, but we can see this other one. We're going to spend a little bit of time. If it becomes a thing, we might invest more in it. Yeah, I think it's how do you learn as quickly as possible? It's basically what it boils down to in order to give you enough confidence to move people's time and effort to
Great. Yeah, go on. I think we've got time.
Thank you for the presentation. It was great. I was wondering if there were any notable people or blogs or resources that you would point kind of a beginner in, or if anyone's been has anyone in particular been inspiring to you recently? So blogs. Or
I think like Lenny's newsletter is kind of the must sort of read or listen to thing in terms of, I guess, sharing the current trends and hearing from a sort of range of different product thinkers. I've always thought Marty Kagan's stuff is good. He's very certain about being right about stuff, and he's getting slightly grumpy old man, but he's like generally like all of his stuff is very good. Teresa Torres in terms of like on that kind of continuous discovery point of view, I definitely recommend, and she writes a newsletter as well. Those would be the kind of top three, I think. I actually got a list of resources somewhere, so maybe I'll share them somewhere that can be shared.
Great. Okay. Any more before we wrap up? One more? Okay. I think we can do one more. And then we'll
go and eat the rest of the pizza.
So what advice would you have for us? So we're about to start focus groups, and they're with United States customers. And I think for us, this is the first time they're doing it with us. And obviously there's that anxiety of how do you make a virtual focus group meaningful, but still get the insights that you need to be able to develop the product more?
Interesting one. So focus groups can be a sort of double-edged sword. And I often say, don't do a focus group, do individual interviews, because A, the planning is much easier. Like getting everyone in one space at one time can be a nightmare. But also, you often get one person lead the conversation and influence the others. And like, particularly if you're asking them something that is maybe sensitive about their business, they may not be as honest as in a kind of one-on-one situation. So I think that's what I'd normally say. Like, focus groups can be interesting. Maybe if you've done some of that initial one-on-one stuff where you almost want to use the group to kind of spark each other to like kind of and like test is this a thing that exists across like different people. And I think particularly in the virtual environment, it could be very easy for one person to dominate, and I think you probably have to facilitate it strongly to make sure that you bring everyone in and you're very clear that like people don't have to agree. Hearing disagree with each other could be kind of interesting. That would be my advice.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we've got one final question for you from online. So Matt, if you can hear me, that's what she's saying. What do you think about using and training AI for education and use of virtual interaction AI characters in education?
There is a lot obviously going on, as in every field in education and AI. I think it has a lot of potential. There's a lot of people that are looking into like tutoring, because like if you can like scale everyone being able to have a personal tutor. But it's kind of interesting in that the people that are doing that in more interesting ways, it's more becomes how do you like use it as a thinking tool and get people to kind of think through, like, don't give them the answer, but like use it as a way of like constant like kind of prompting them. I saw somebody that I worked with a bit who was a student, he started a startup where it's working with like in the States, they have got a big movement of micro schools, and it came out of the pandemic where like lots of people ended up doing like homeschooling. Some kids went back to school and struggled, or their parents decided that actually like schooling in a smaller sort of more independent way was interesting. So there's this big movement, and the part of like the curriculum is that in the afternoons they do self-guided projects. So he's ended up creating a tool where basically it talks to the kid about what they want to learn and like asks them lots of questions, and then starts to share kind of resources with them to then like, and they've still got like a human in the mix. So like I think generally humans in the mix still, but being like as a co-pilot, I think is probably at this point in time more interesting. But yeah, I thought it was kind of fascinating that, like, in terms of like kind of self-directed learning and actually kids doing what they kind of want to do and running their own projects. That was in a way a lot of work for like humans to do it, but then like actually still having humans making sure that the things it's giving are the right things and still coaching the kids. I thought was really interesting. So I think it's about trying to find the humanity in it and the combination of co-pilot and robot.
Great. Nice one. Okay, big round of applause then for Matt. Thanks so much.